Hey there. Tonight we begin with something quieter. A classroom without windows, a stone bench without cushions, and a teacher who mostly speaks in Latin, even when you don't understand him. You've just been sent to a monastery school in 12th century England. Not to play, not to explore, but to memorize things you'll never use, or so it seems. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. It's early morning, and the monastery bell rings before the sun's even done rising. You're maybe 10 years old, maybe a bit older. You wear the same rough wool as yesterday, still itchy from sleep. And your feet are cold because boots aren't worn inside the classroom. The floor is stone. The air smells of ink, beeswax, and yesterday's boiled peas. Your first lesson of the day. Latin grammar again. The same conjugations you've been repeating for weeks. Amo, amars, amat, I love, you love, he loves. But there's little love in this classroom. The master stands at the front with a rod in hand, not because he's cruel exactly, but because that's how discipline is taught. A sharp rap on the knuckles if you forget a tense, a scowl if you confuse a vowel, and silence, always silence, unless he's the one speaking. You're not alone. Beside you, a dozen other boys sit hunched over scrap parchment or wooden tablets. Some are sons of minor nobility, others the younger children of farmers sent here. In the hope of a better life, reading and writing aren't common, and the monastery offers one of the few ways to learn. Not for fun, of course, for scripture, for copying, and eventually for servitude. You glance down at your wax tablet. You've scraped the last exercise clean with the flat edge of your stylus, but your fingers are stiff and slow. Writing takes time, and neatness matters. A messy Latin sentence might mean more time after class, rewriting by candlelight until your hands cramp. The master clears his throat. Today's reading is from Donatus, the same Roman grammarian whose textbook has been copied and recopied for centuries. The monks think it's the best way to teach clarity. You think it's dull. Still, you read aloud, slowly and with care, because the last time you mumbled a line, you were made to stand for the rest of the morning. There's a rhythm to it. Eventually, you begin to sink into the pace of it all. The rustle of parchment, the scratching of quills, the low drone of chanting verbs. Outside, the wind groans softly against the walls, and you wonder, briefly, what it would be like to study somewhere warm. Maybe in Italy. Maybe where the ink doesn't freeze in winter. But then you remember, even there the masters shout. Even there the students squirm, mid-morning comes, and you're given a break. Not to play, just to eat a bit of coarse bread and dried peas. You huddle near the small brazier for warmth. One of the older boys, Robert, tries to sneak a joke about the master's bald head, but no one laughs too loudly. Laughter carries, and too much noise brings questions. After break, it's time for dictation. The master reads a line, slowly, clearly, and you're meant to write it exactly as spoken. Spelling isn't standardized yet, but the monastery expects consistency. You misplace a syllable, he notices. You hear his sandals scrape toward. A pause, then a correction, soft, this time. You were lucky. Maybe he's tired today. The rest of the afternoon drags. Some students copy psalms. Others work on penmanship, repeating the same phrase again and again. Discipline is the soul of learning. You're not sure you believe that. You think discipline is the rod, and learning is whatever happens in between. Occasionally, you catch sight of the scriptorium, the separate chamber where the real scribes work. Older monks, their backs bent and faces lit by dim windows, ink lines of poetry and scripture into massive books, illuminated pages trimmed with gold. You wonder if they ever get bored. You suspect they do. By evening, your lessons are done. The candle in your corner burns low. Your fingers are stained with ink, and your ears still ring with grammar rules. You walk back to your chamber in the dormitory. It's not much warmer than the classroom. You curl up under a wool blanket, still thinking about Amo, Amars, Amat, and you wonder, did the teacher always know this much? Or did he have to sit on the same cold benches once, flinch at the same rod, and whisper the same Latin verbs until they became muscle memory? The day ends not with a sense of achievement, but with survival. You made it through, and tomorrow you'll do it again. Because that's how monastic school works. Slow, repetitive, and quiet enough to make a boy forget what outside even smells like. Still, in that silence, a kind of rhythm, a kind of safety. Now, close your eyes. Let the sound of dripping wax and soft footsteps lull you deeper. Tomorrow we'll explore more what students ate, what they feared, and how they sometimes fought back against all this silence. So the bell rings again, and you wake before the sky has shifted from black to grey. Sleep still clings to your bones, and the wool blanket itched all night. It's colder this morning. You dress in silence, as always. No talking in the dormitory. No delay. The others are already slipping out one by one, feet quiet on the stone. You think about pretending to be sick, just for a moment. But there's no point. Illness in a monastery school doesn't get you a rest day. It just gets you extra prayers and weaker broth. Breakfast is a single chunk of bread, cracked at the edges, dipped in watered wine if you're lucky. No meat. Meat is for feast days. Today is not one of those. You chew slowly and count the cracks in the table. The older boy beside you, a curly-haired lad called Stephen, mutters something about the bread being moldy again. You both smirk but don't laugh. The master is watching. Always watching. Today begins, not with Latin, but with moral instruction. That means stories from the Bible, or the sayings of saints, spoken in slow Latin and translated bit by bit. You're supposed to listen for the wisdom, for the rules about humility, silence, and obedience. But mostly, you're listening for which saint got eaten by lions, and which monk fasted for 40 days. Sometimes the stories blur together. They all end the same. Be quiet, be good, and do what you're told. But not every student listens. There's always one. In your class, it's Ethelred. He's clever, sharper than most, and knows how to speak Latin fluently. But he's also tired of copying, tired of rules. He misquotes a psalm on purpose, smirks when he's corrected, and once wrote a line from a bawdy drinking song at the bottom of a lesson sheet. In Latin, the master found it. Ethelred was kept on his knees through the noon hour, reciting the Lord's Prayer until his voice cracked. Still, you think he's brave, maybe even foolishly so. The thing is, monastic school isn't about talent, it's about endurance. You can be bright, but if you speak out of turn, or question why you're learning the genealogies of saints, you'll be met with silence. Or worse, with the soft hiss of a birch switch on skin. So most of you keep your heads down. You learn to murmur the chants, copy the lines, and blend in. Some lessons are harder than others, like when you're made to memorize verses in Latin and recite them one after the other, while standing still. Your legs ache, your voice shakes, and if you make a mistake, you have to start again. Not from your place, from the beginning. You wonder how monks don't go mad from repetition, but that's the thing. Repetition is the point. The rules of Latin are like the rules of faith, unchanging, unforgiving, and meant to be followed by midday, you're copying again. This time, it's a long passage from Isidore of Seville, a bishop who lived centuries ago and wrote about everything from grammar to animals to the nature of God. You don't understand half of it. Most students don't. But your job isn't to understand, it's to copy without error. Mistakes cost time and ink. Ink is precious. It's made from oak galls, boiled and mixed with iron salts. It smells faintly metallic. Each drop is watched. If you spill, it's recorded. If you waste parchment, it's worse. Some boys are made to scrub old sheets, clean and reuse them. Parchment isn't cheap. It comes from animal hides, scraped and stretched. You can still see the veins if you hold it to the light, and the quills. Not every bird makes a good writing. Quill, goose feathers are preferred. The masters shape them with tiny knives, testing each nib on the margin. You once saw a boy cut his finger trying to sharpen his own. He wasn't punished. He was just told to keep writing. The hours blur. The lines on the page grow crooked as your eyes tire. Sometimes your hand cramps so badly that your letters tilt downward like they're falling asleep to dot. By evening, there's Vespers prayers again, then a small supper and more silence. You think about what it would be like to leave. Some boys do. They run. They vanish. Usually poor ones, with no name to protect them. Sometimes they're caught, dragged back, and flogged. Sometimes they're never found. Rumors say they join traveling singers, or sneak aboard carts to London. But no one really knows. For now, you stay. Because despite the cold, and the hunger, and the lectures that never seem to end, there's something about the stillness here, something old and strange and heavy with purpose. These lessons, as dull and repetitive as they seem, might one day lead to the scriptorium, or to a post in a cathedral, or even to a life with books instead of fields. You fall asleep that night, tracing grammar rules in your mind. Third, declension nouns. Irregular verbs, the difference between some and esse. Somewhere in your dreams, Ethelred is being scolded again, and the master is quoting Saint Jerome with that same dry tone. And you wonder, did students always feel this way? Did every boy in every monastery stare at the same words, trying to stay awake, trying to stay quiet, wondering if they were the only ones struggling? Maybe you'll find out. Tomorrow we'll look deeper into what these schools were really training you for. Not just monks and scribes, but the long, tedious road to becoming someone whose words mattered. For now, rest. Let the scratch of quills and the drone of chants fade into quiet. There's more to come. The bell rings again. You know its sound by heart. Now, deep, slow, and hollow. It doesn't tell time so much as command it. Rise, pray, eat, learn, repeat. You wake in the dormitory just like before. Eyes gritty, muscles sore from sleeping on a straw mattress that always feels slightly damp. One of the boys down the row coughs and no one reacts. Coughing is normal. Shivering is normal. What isn't normal is asking for more food, more sleep, or more comfort. That kind of complaint won't get you sympathy. It'll get you extra prayers. Today begins like every other. The master enters. Sandals scraping over stone, a parchment tucked under one arm, and that same rod hanging loosely from the other. He doesn't need to use it often, just holding it is enough. But today he surprises you. He says there's to be a public recitation this afternoon. Everyone will have to stand and read aloud something they've written, a small commentary, a copied psalm, a translation. Your heart sinks. You glance down at your wax tablet. You've been working on a sentence from Boethius, something about fortune and change. But your writing is crooked. You've scratched the wax too deeply. You'll have to scrape it smooth again and start over. The hours pass in silence, broken only by the occasional cough or whisper. You copy, you recopy, you press your lips together. Every time your stylus slips, you practice pronouncing the words under your breath. Omnia, mutanta, nihil, interit. Everything changes, nothing perishes. The phrase echoes in your mind, and it feels strange to say it here, in a school that seems to never change at all. By midday, the room smells of stale breath, wool, and ink. The windows are narrow slits, letting in barely enough light to read by. You squint until your eyes sting. Ethelred sits nearby, scowling at his parchment. You hear him mutter a word in Old English, something unrepeatable, and then scratch out his last line in frustration when the time comes. The master calls each student forward, one by one. Some stutter, some freeze. One boy begins to cry, barely audible as he tries to finish his verse. He's sent back to his seat, eyes wet, hands trembling. Then it's your turn. You stand. Your knees are stiff. You clutch your wax tablet like it's a shield. You begin to speak. The words come slowly, but you don't falter. You've said them so many times already. The rhythm carries you through. When you're done, the master gives a small nod, nothing more. But in this place, that nod might as well be a standing ovation. You sit back down and exhale. For the first time in days, your hands feel steady. Later that evening, the master gives a rare lecture. He doesn't read from scripture. He talks about books. He says that copying is not just about practice, it's about preservation. That a boy in this room might write a page that survives for hundreds of years. That monks are guardians of memory. That grammar is a kind of armor against chaos. You look around. The boys are half asleep. But something about his voice tonight, quieter, more thoughtful, makes you listen more closely. He tells you a story about Cassiodorus, a Roman who built a monastery where monks did nothing but write, copying Aristotle, translating Greek, illuminating Bibles with gold leaf and patience. It sounds like something from a different world, but he says it happened, and that it still happens, even here. You think, for the first time, that maybe this classroom isn't a cage. Maybe it's a doorway, a narrow one, cold and slow, but still leading somewhere. Still, not everyone will walk through it. Some boys will leave. Some will become parish priests, barely literate, shouting sermons from memory. Some will take jobs as clerks or messengers. Some will forget most of what they learned. But others, a few, will become scribes, monks, teachers. They'll sit in this same room and watch a younger boy flinch under the same rod. And so it goes, 1,000 times over. Later that night, lying under your blanket, you listen to the wind pressing against the dormitory wall. The candle near the door gutters. A mouse rustles in the straw. Someone murmurs in their sleep, probably reciting a verse out of habit. You stare at the beams above. and your mind drifts not to the classroom, but to the scriptorium, to the pages yet to be copied, to the tiny marks of ink that might outlast even the stones of this monastery. And you wonder if your words someday ended up in a book, copied and recopied long after you're gone. Would anyone know it was you who first scratched them into wax with cold fingers? But that's not for now. Now let your thoughts soften. Let the dull ache of your hands and the quiet flicker of candlelight guide you downward into rest. Tomorrow we'll begin a new journey somewhere different, yet still dusty with forgotten learning. It starts with a knock at the chamber door. Not a sharp knock, not the kind that demands attention, but the hesitant knock of a manservant who knows that someone inside the room does not want to be woken. The fire in the hearth is still burning low, throwing shadows across the stone. Walls, outside, the mist clings to the ground like a damp quilt. It's not yet light, but already the household is stirring. Somewhere in the distance, a stable boy sneezes, a cook coughs behind a closed door, and in a bed piled high with blankets stitched with falcons and vines, a noble child sighs deeply. He's already awake, of course. He's been awake for a while now, staring at the beams above, hoping the day might be cancelled. But days in a castle don't cancel themselves, especially not days with tutors. The child rolls out of bed slowly, bare feet touching the wool rug stretched across the cold stone. He's about 8 years old, or maybe 10. Age is always a little uncertain in these households, especially if you're not the heir. He puts on a tunic embroidered with his family's crest, half lion, half something that never looked quite right. Then, grumbling, he slips into soft leather slippers and trudges toward the smaller side chamber that smells faintly of ink and dried rushes. The study room, his least favorite room. The tutor is already there. Naturally, they always are. A thin, dry man with ink-stained fingers and a forehead that never relaxes. He's not noble, not even close, but he has permission to correct noble children, which gives him a quiet, dangerous power. On the desk, 2 wax tablets, 1 quill with a crooked nib, and a tiny jar of ink sealed with beeswax. There's also a heavy book, Liber Doctrinae, something copied long ago in a monastery, its pages thick and yellowing. The cover still has faint grooves from a chain, which once kept it tied to a lectern in some cathedral library. Today's lesson, Latin again. It's always Latin. Verbs, mostly, amor, amas, amat. The boy slouches in the chair, which is far too straight-backed for comfort, and stares at the candle instead. It flickers. The wind whistles through the narrow slit of a window. The tutor begins with dictation, slowly, quietly, like a priest giving penance. Fortuna variabilis est. Fortune is changeable. The child repeats it, lazily. Fortuna, ... variable ... something. The tutor doesn't scold. He just repeats it again, then again, a 4th time. By the 5th, the child is mouthing it correctly, but not writing anything. His wax tablet sits untouched, except for a single thumbprint pressed into the middle. Across the hall, a servant walks by with fresh rushes bundled under one arm. Somewhere in the courtyard, a falcon shrieks. These are the distractions that plague noble lessons. Too many sounds, too many rooms, too many other people not having to study. By mid-morning, the boy has finally copied the line twice. The letters slope downhill. He presses too hard, so the stylus gouges the wax, but it's acceptable. The tutor nods once. That's the most praise he'll get today. Some noble children are better at this. especially the ones destined for church positions. They try harder, maybe because they have to, maybe because they like the order of it, the patterns, the rules, the way Latin makes the world feel knowable. But this boy, he's not one of those. He doesn't understand why he needs Latin at all. He asks once, in a tone that borders on impolite. The tutor's answer is long, and the boy only hears part of it. Something about law and letters and being able to read what bishops send. He tunes out after that. Later, there is a short reading from a psalter. The boy is meant to chant the lines aloud, but his voice wobbles, and he mumbles the vowels. The tutor, very gently, clears his throat and says nothing. After that, arithmetic, a small slate board is brought out. Peas are used as counters. Little round dried peas, some split, some whole. The boy has to add them, group them by fives, then tens. But halfway through, he begins flicking them toward the fireplace just to see if they'll bounce. They don't. The tutor sighs, a small sound, almost imperceptible. Then it's midday, and the lessons pause. A tray is brought in with bread and cheese, a cup of weak ale, a napkin with embroidery along the edges. The boy eats quickly, but not eagerly. The cheese smells like the cellar again. He dips it in the ale, like he saw the steward do once. After the tray is cleared, the child is meant to practice writing his name, over and over, first on the wax, then, if he's careful, with ink. He is not careful. He dips the quill too deep and splatters the parchment. It leaves a blot shaped like a rabbit. He laughs at that. The tutor does not. Still, the name is there, wobbly, misaligned, a few letters reversed. But it's there. That means something. In the afternoon, he gets one small mercy, a story. The tutor reads aloud from a book of moral tales. Something about a knight who stole a relic and was swallowed by the earth. The boy listens only to the good parts, the sword fight, the horse that talks, the thunder that split the abbey roof. After that, he's dismissed. He walks back to his room slowly, past the gallery with the dusty paintings, past the door that always creaks, even when no one touches it. The fire in his chamber is still burning, though it's low now. He curls back onto his bed, fully dressed, shoes and all. He's not tired. Exactly, but he's heavy. The kind of heavy that comes from long hours of nothing in particular. He lies there for a long time, staring at the beam overhead again. The same beam he looked at that morning. It hasn't changed. Maybe tomorrow's lesson will be about animals, or saints, or heraldry. Anything but verbs. He closes his eyes. The wax tablet is still on the desk behind him, still pressed with that thumbprint, and the tutor is probably sharpening quills, quietly, for tomorrow. You wonder, did any of those noble children ever grow to love their lessons? Or did they all just wait for the day they could stop pretending? In the eastern wing of the manor, where the sun rises earliest and the windows are set in arched stone, there's a different kind of silence. Not the heavy, holy stillness of a monastery, and not the chaotic hush of a crowded village. This is the kind of quiet that lingers between pauses in a tutor's voice, or the turning of a vellum page. The noble child is a little older now, perhaps 12. His fingers are longer, and he holds the stylus with more control than he did a few winters ago. But the mornings are still the same. Cold floor, thick slippers, sour breath, and reluctant steps toward the lesson chamber. There are more books on the shelves these days, mostly borrowed or inherited from nearby abbeys. A few are family copies, passed down carefully, their margins marked with the squiggles of bored ancestors, psalters, prayer books, a Roman history or two, copied out in shaky hands and bound in pigskin. Today's lesson is rhetoric, not the inspiring kind, not Cicero or grand speeches before kings. No, this is letter writing. Formal, proper, obedient. The tutor begins slowly. He explains how a young noble must write to his father, to his cousin, to a bishop, to a merchant. There are rules, greetings, closings, careful flattery, and spacing. Each letter must begin with honor. Each request must sound like a suggestion, never a demand. Even when you're writing to someone lower than you, the child listens, then copies. To my most wise and generous uncle, the phrase tastes dry in his mouth. He's met that uncle only once. He gave him a stale apple and told him not to fidget. The boy pauses. His ink has run thin. The tutor waits outside. A dog barks. Inside, the fire crackles, and somewhere in the rafters, a small bird flutters, unnoticed. The castle is alive, but the study room is still, like a preserved jar of pickled thoughts. Later that day, the boy practices his handwriting, this time with real ink. No wax, no shortcuts. The parchment curls slightly at the edges from the moisture in the air. He dips the quill carefully, gently taps it on the rim, then writes slowly. It takes him 20 minutes to copy a single passage. From a sermon, the quill stutters. His elbow aches. He rubs it, then leans on the other side, but he finishes. The tutor praises him, a small nodding praise, but praise nonetheless. It's strange, isn't it? For all their power, noble children aren't allowed to know nothing, even if the learning comes slowly or bitterly, or through endless repetition, it must come. They're taught to read, to write, to recite prayers they may not yet understand. Sometimes they're taught in Latin, sometimes French, sometimes the rough, creaking language of their own people, which no one seems to want written down. There is no standardized spelling, no neat rules. The boy spells Christian with 2 different endings in the same letter. The tutor doesn't correct it. Maybe he didn't notice, or maybe that's just how it is. A little inconsistency folded into every page. When the boy grows frustrated, he's given a break. Not a long one, just a few minutes to stand by the window. The glass is cloudy, handmade. It warps the world outside like ripples in a pond. He sees a goose walking across the courtyard, wobbling. A woman drawing water. A small boy chasing a dog with a stick. They're all doing things, moving, laughing. He goes back to his lesson. In the afternoons, the instruction shifts. Today, it's genealogy. The tutor brings out a long parchment scroll, carefully rolled and bound in red thread. The boy's family line is drawn out like a tree, though it doesn't look like a tree, more like a chain. Links upon links of uncles, cousins, mothers, fathers, all stitched together in ink. The boy must memorize the names. He repeats them, dull and slow. Godwin, Leofric, Emma, Baldwin, Ethelred, Baldwin, again. The names pile on top of each other, like stones in a river. He's told that knowing these names is power. He doesn't feel powerful, he feels hungry. Later still, he's taught music. Not performance, not the kind played on lutes at banquets, but notation, notes, plain chant. He's shown how to read the lines and dots, how to match sound to symbol. It's abstract, a kind of math for the ears. The boy hums the wrong tone. Then again, eventually, he gets close. It's enough. But when no one's looking, he invents his own songs. Little rhymes about the steward's bad breath. A tune about the cat who stole the cheese. Songs he never writes down. Songs not meant for parchment. These private songs live only in his head. A quiet rebellion. A melody of small resistance. Evenings bring review. A small candle, a small desk, a small boy reading back his letters by firelight. The words are faint, the ink is uneven, but he's reading them. That's something he doesn't always understand what he's reading. But he sounds confident. That's also something the tutor says tomorrow. They will begin learning about land boundaries, how to read old maps, how to measure fields, how to count tenants. The boy doesn't ask why. He never asks why anymore. Only when will this end? When will it matter? When will the knowledge become action? But those are questions for older voices. For now, he turns the page. Outside the castle, the sky deepens to charcoal. One more lamp is lit in the hall. A moth flutters against the window pane inside. The tutor's voice continues, low, even steady, and the boy copies the final sentence of the day. He who studies quietly will one day be heard by kings. Maybe, or maybe he'll just be tired, and as the ink dries and the candle burns lower, you wonder how many of those lessons stayed with them when the sword replaced the stylus. The noble child is now nearly grown. His voice has deepened. He walks with more purpose, or at least he's learned how to fake it. His shoes are still stiff and lined with wool, and he still hates mornings, but he no longer dawdles. Not because he loves learning, but because, at this age, hesitating brings questions. Questions lead to longer lessons. The castle halls feel smaller than they did when he was 10. The lesson chamber, once a place of silent torture, is now simply routine. The same worn bench, the same wooden box of ink, the same tutor, a little older, a little wearier, with a slower limp when he moves across the stone floor. There's less repetition now, more application. Today, the young noble is being taught how to draft a contract, a real one, a mock agreement between himself and a tenant farmer over the leasing of a barley field. The document must be clear. It must mention names, dates, expectations. It must appear generous, but leave no room for doubt about ownership. It takes the boy, now nearly a man, the better part of an hour to write for paragraphs. The ink flows steadily. His handwriting is no longer childish, but his brow stays furrowed the whole time. The tutor says nothing until he finishes. Then he nods. That nod means more than it used to. Later there is a recitation. The noble youth must recall the laws of inheritance. Who receives what, in what order, under what circumstances. It's dull, terribly dull, the kind of knowledge that never appears in stories or songs. But it matters more than songs. One wrong assumption, and an entire manor could slip from the family's hands. The young man knows this. His older cousin once lost a village to a rival family because a clause was misunderstood. Now that cousin serves in someone else's hall. In the early afternoons, the learning shifts again, this time to diplomacy. Letters are drafted again and again, one to a bishop, politely declining a visit. One to a noblewoman in the next county, thanking her for a gift that was never received. One to the local reeve, demanding back payments in a tone that sounds gentle. But ISN single quotes, each letter is judged on tone, balance, and subtlety. You must sound above someone without sounding insulting. You must offer friendship without offering favors. Writing is no longer just an exercise, it's a performance, a balancing act with ink. There are also oral lessons, practicing conversation, posture, and memory. The young noble is told that every word he speaks may one day be repeated by someone else. So every word must be chosen like a coin from a purse, carefully, sparingly, and with a purpose. It isn't always lonely. Sometimes he shares lessons with a younger sibling or a visiting cousin. They whisper between exercises. They invent stories using Latin words, twisting grammar for laughs. They hide ink blots under their cuffs. It's quiet rebellion. It's also the only joy that comes with studying for hours beneath heavy stone ceilings. But even laughter is limited. There's an expectation always to grow out of joy, to become something solid, serious, dependable. Once a week, the tutor takes him to the family archive, a damp room with shelves of parchment rolls and bound manuscripts, most of them unread in decades. He is taught to read old handwriting, faded ink, outdated phrasing. A letter from his great-grandfather lies in a chest, still sealed with wax. They open it. Inside is a note about a failed harvest and a loan from a bishop. The handwriting is cramped and the Latin is odd, but the problem is familiar. Land, debt, hope. The past echoes in these papers, not as stories, but as spreadsheets of struggle. Evenings are now reserved for philosophy, not the soaring metaphysics of Aristotle that will come later, but the grounded reflections of churchmen and teachers, writings on obedience, humility, the nature of authority, the kind of reading that shapes how a nobleman sees the world, and how he expects the world to see him. He reads slowly, then discusses with the tutor. What is power? What is fairness? Why must a tenant obey? And what happens when they do not? He is told that answers are not always given, but the questions must always be asked. Sometimes the tutor grows quiet after a discussion. He stares at the fire. The young man waits. Then the tutor simply says, "That's enough for today," and they close the book together. But not all lessons are abstract. One day, he is made to calculate the grain needed to feed a small village for a winter. He must factor in bad weather, theft, poor roads, and unexpected guests. His first estimate is far too low. The tutor says nothing. He just leaves the room. The noble youth recalculates. Another time, he must settle a mock dispute between two tenants. He plays the role of judge, seated on a chair with a pillow to lift him higher. One tenant accuses the other of moving a fence, post to steal land. The young man listens, hesitates, then rules in favor of the one with stronger evidence. The tutor nods again, then says, "You hesitated too long." In real disputes, time is a luxury you rarely have. By now, the young noble can read most texts set in front of him. He can write clearly, persuade diplomatically, and think with care. But does he feel wise? He's not sure. There are things the tutor never taught. How to know who's lying. How to know when to speak and when to stay silent. How to deal with loneliness, or fear, or sudden illness. Those aren't written in books. As spring returns to the castle, and the last of the snow melts from the roof tiles, the tutor hands him a final assignment. It's not a text to copy, or a letter to draft. It's a single question. What kind of lord do you wish to be? The boy, no. The young man does not answer right away. He takes the paper, folds it, and walks away. Sometimes, learning ends not with an answer, but with a better question. And as the ink dries in the quietest corners of the keep, you might wonder how many noble children truly became wise men, and how many just became older boys in taller chairs. Now let your thoughts trail off like those forgotten parchments, the ones no longer read, but still kept in drawers, waiting quietly beneath dust and time. It starts quietly, not in a grand hall, but in a cloistered room behind a church. A few young men, cloaked in wool, gather with folded parchments in their hands. The air smells of candle wax and old wood. Outside, the bell of a nearby cathedral sounds the hour, not for class, but for prayer. In the beginning, there are no universities, only gatherings. Scholars who've wandered from one town to another, some former monks, some clerics without posts, and students hoping to learn something useful or at least impressive. Theology, mostly. Some logic, a little law, if the teacher had once been to Bologna. No one uses the word professor. Not yet. There is no formal fee. Just a custom of paying the teacher a few coins, sometimes wrapped in cloth, sometimes tucked inside a loaf of bread to be discreet. One student might pay more, another less. Some pay nothing and just listen from the back, pretending to belong. And the teaching, it's mostly oral. A master speaks slowly in Latin, explaining Aristotle, through a layer of Christian gloss, while students squint and scroll fragments on reused parchment. Sometimes they borrow each other's notes. Sometimes they just whisper the lesson back to themselves, over and over. Like a prayer, the city is Paris, but it could have been Oxford, or Bologna, or Padua. The pattern is spreading now, slow, as ivy on stone, but persistent. The towns don't quite know what to make of these gatherings. They bring coin, but also quarrels. Students get drunk. Teachers argue with priests. Ink spills where it shouldn't. Still, it grows. No one calls it a university yet. That word universitas just means a guild, a group of people acting as one, and that's what this is. A guild of learners, a brotherhood of minds, fragile and flickering in Paris. By the early 12th century, the cathedral schools are overwhelmed. Too many students, not enough teachers, so informal schools pop up in rented rooms, sometimes an attic, sometimes a cellar. One class might be held in a baker's upstairs room, another beside a tannery, where the smell never quite fades. Students arrive from all over, from the English coast, from the German forests, from Spain, where Arabic commentaries on Greek texts have only recently crossed the Pyrenees. They travel on foot, mostly, with a satchel, a wool blanket, and a few letters of recommendation from a local priest. They arrive hungry, literally and figuratively. There's no syllabus, no printed materials, no classroom as we'd recognize it. Just benches, scrolls, and sometimes a carved tablet where a teacher can scratch a diagram with chalk or coal. The lessons begin with a reading, a sacred or classical text, and then a commentary, then a discussion, sometimes a dispute. Always in Latin, always formal. The language is a gatekeeper. If you cannot speak it fluently, you cannot enter the conversation. Outside, the city continues. Paris bustles with traders and cooks and fishmongers. The Seine smells strange in summer. Inside, students study by candlelight. The wax drips onto their robes. Their eyes strain. The parchment is too expensive to waste. A single mistake must be carefully scraped off with a blade, then rubbed smooth with powdered pumice. But still they write, slowly, carefully, hoping to remember just enough of the lesson to repeat it later. Memory is currency here, and quoting the right phrase at the right time in the right accent can earn you a reputation. There are no grades, no report cards, only reputation, connections, and the judgment of your master. And yet, somehow, something bigger is forming, a shape, a structure, agreements between teachers and townspeople, students organizing into nations, not political, but regional groupings. The English stick with the English, the Normans with Normans. They elect deans to speak for them. They share expenses. Sometimes they riot, especially if the local alehouse overcharges them by the mid-12th century. The Bishop of Paris has noticed. So has the Pope. Learning is useful. It must be protected and controlled, so privileges are granted. The right to teach, the right to self-govern, the right to be tried under church law instead of secular law, which leads to long debates about what happens when a student punches a baker. Over time, the school becomes something official, not a building, but a legal person, a university, a community of scholars with its own rights and its own rules. A city within the city. The master's robes grow heavier. The students now wear hoods that signal their level of study. A hierarchy forms bachelors, masters, doctors. It's still chaotic, still uncomfortable, but it has momentum now, more. Towns follow. Bologna organizes its law faculty. Oxford sees an exodus from Paris and becomes its own rival. Padua, Salamanca, Montpellier. The dust of learning rises in different corners of Europe, but none of it looks like a university, not the way we imagine it now. There are no lecture halls, no libraries with neat shelves, no tenured professors or printed handouts, just chalk, just parchment, just words passed from one tired voice to a tired hand, one slow morning at a time. So when did it become a university? That's hard to say. Maybe when the students agreed to fine each other for bad behavior. Maybe when a bishop allowed them to hold their own court. Maybe when a teacher first said, "I grant you the right to teach others." Or maybe it never quite became one. It just continued, messy, unfinished, and entirely human. And as the candlelight flickers in some cold upper room and a student scratches the final line of a borrowed sentence onto a reused scrap of parchment, you might wonder how much knowledge was lost simply because the ink ran out. The cold settles in early by mid-autumn. The stone walls of the rented teaching halls, if you could call them that, have begun to leak wind. Most are not insulated. A few have thin tapestries, donated by patrons who hoped their sons might one day be praised in a disputation. But mostly, the students sit in cloaks, hands tucked into sleeves, noses running quietly, ink stiffening in the inkwell, and still the lessons continue. This is no longer the phase of accident. The gatherings have survived their awkward beginnings. In cities like Paris, Bologna, and Oxford, the communities of learning have started to negotiate with the cities around them and with each other. Students demand safety. Teachers demand freedom. Both demand something new, stability. The medieval university, as it begins to take shape in the 13th century, is not a single idea. It is a layered compromise between town and gown, between church and scholar, between memory and ambition. In Paris, the theology faculty begins to dominate. These are not light lectures. They are difficult, dense, and conducted entirely in Latin. The master sits at a raised chair. Students sit on low benches or on the ground. The master's job is to read a sentence from a chosen text, often Peter Lombard's sentences, and then interpret it, bit by bit, word by word. Students rarely interrupt. That comes later, in DISPUTATION. Most of the time, they just listen, and copy, and squint. Each lecture might last 2 hours, sometimes more. No heating, no refreshments, no bathroom breaks, just patience, and cold. Toes in Bologna, things are a little different. The students hold more power there. They organize their own administration. They even pay and fire their teachers. Here, law is king. Roman law, canon law, the dense, winding paths of legal precedent, become the backbone of an education meant to prepare students for service in the church or for royal courts. It is tedious work, but vital. The margin notes become almost as important as the texts themselves. Sometimes entire texts are borrowed or rented for a day, and students work in shifts to copy them, a practice called petcha, where texts are broken into pieces to be duplicated by hand in rotation. It is slow and frequently inaccurate, but it is how books travel, word by fragile word. No one owns a full library. Most students have just 1 or 2 texts, usually borrowed or inherited. In Paris, the university eventually sets up a kind of central book station, the stationer system, where authorized scribes copy works for use by students, and librarians guard what few volumes exist. These are chained books, literally, attached to shelves with iron links to prevent theft. And still, despite the cold, despite the ink stains and hunger, more students come. They are not children. Most are in their late teens or early 20s. Many are already ordained. Some have traveled weeks to get here. They live in cheap housing, sometimes with townsfolk, sometimes in communal dormitories supported by benefactors or church officials. Food is simple. Bread, onions, beans, maybe dried fish, beer, or watered wine, but not too much, unless it's a feast day, and then restraint crumbles. And when they're not in class, they argue that's not a joke. Formal disputation is one of the key parts of the curriculum. After a reading, students are expected to offer objections or contrary opinions, which the master then addresses. These debates are not fiery. They're structured, careful, and almost scripted, but the process is valued. It shows the student can think, can remember, can quote, and above all, can conform to the expectations of logic. For higher degrees, students must sometimes defend a thesis publicly. Imagine a dim hall, candles flickering, 2 or 3 masters watching as a student stands stiffly and recites an argument about whether angels can move from place to place, or if they are perpetually still, or whether the soul is created at birth or before. It is not meant to thrill. It is meant to test patience, precision, and the ability to cite 3 authorities without blinking. The degrees themselves evolve slowly. A Bachelor of Arts, then a Master, then, if one persists through theology or law, a doctorate. But this takes years, sometimes a decade or more. And not everyone finishes. Many leave after a year or 2, especially if they get offered a post somewhere, as a scribe, a clerk, or a minor priest. And for women, officially, no. The medieval university is almost entirely male. Women of noble birth might be educated in convents, and a few extraordinarily rare women, like Hildegard of Bingen, receive informal recognition for their learning. But they are not allowed to lecture. They are not granted degrees. They are not permitted inside the walls where these debates take place. Their education, like their presence in the archive, remains faint and scattered. And what about the church? The church is both guardian and gatekeeper. It grants privileges to universities, but it also watches them closely. When masters begin teaching ideas that seem dangerous, like the works of Avros or challenges to papal authority, they are summoned, censured, sometimes exiled. A few go underground, others recant. Academic freedom, as we know it, does not yet exist, but the idea is flickering, like a candle at the back of the hall, visible only when the shadows shift, and through it all, the daily grind continues. The lectures, the copying, the memorization, the careful disputes about the meaning of words long dead, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the institution begins to ossify. Charters are written, rules are codified, faculties are divided into four: arts, theology, law, and medicine. Robes are standardized. Students begin to register formally. Professors are given housing or stipends. The university becomes a kind of machine, slow, inefficient, but undeniably alive. And even as cities fall into famine or kings rise and fall, the university endures. Students still sit in rows, freezing in winter, sweating in summer, listening to a tired voice echo off cold stone. The world outside changes, but here, in these dim rooms, learning creeps forward, word by dusty word. And as the day draws to a close, and the last candle gutters in a drafty window, one might wonder, did they know they were building something that would still be here 800 years later? There is a silence in stone. If you arrive early, before the lectures begin, before the bells toll, you can hear it. In the cloisters, in the drafty stairwells, even in the chill echo of a chapel where a single student kneels in quiet prayer, fingering the edge of a thin parchment. The university is not loud. It never was. It is a place of patient muttering, of ink-smeared fingers, and of whispered arguments that never quite reach a shout. By the mid-14th century, these institutions have taken firmer root. Bologna continues to anchor itself in law. Paris leans heavily into theology. Oxford and Cambridge, those damp northern seedlings, begin to harden into traditions of their own. Across the Holy Roman Empire, smaller schools form, fragment, reform in Prague, Vienna, Cologne, Heidelberg, and what once began as borrowed rooms and unpaid teachers is now a structure complete with papal charters, administrative councils, and slowly codified rules of conduct. But life inside remains ... uncomfortable. Students still complain, and not just about the cold. They complain about the prices of food, the cost of ink, the dullness of their masters' voices. They complain about curfews and fines and the petty hierarchies that have begun to develop among the faculties. Even in the 14th century, a few scrawled notes have survived in margins, saying things like hoc, magesta, nihil, dicet. This teacher says nothing, and yet they stay. Why? Maybe for the same reasons students stay today. To chase something, or escape something, or because they think it might matter later. Or perhaps just because it's where the books are, and there are more books now. Slowly, imperfectly, the system of petcocopying has grown, supported by professional scribes. Libraries, though still tiny by modern standards, begin to accumulate. In colleges and monasteries, students with wealth might own 5 or 6 texts, precious things full of glosses, marginalia, and the occasional rude drawing. One surviving note in a Paris text reads, "He who steals this book shall be hung, by his feet and his soul damned." A reminder that these weren't just possessions. They were lifelines. And in these halls, some students, not many, but some, begin to stretch the rules. They question the shape of the heavens. They borrow from the works of Aristotle, Avros, Maimonides. They wrestle with Augustine and Aquinas. They argue, quietly but persistently, about the balance between reason and faith. And sometimes, the arguments spill out into the streets. In Oxford, there is violence. The so-called town and gown riots, when locals and students clash over prices, pride, or drunken insults. In Paris, the university goes on strike for 2 full years in the 13th century after a group of students is killed by city guards. The masters leave, classes stop, the entire academic apparatus halts, until the Pope himself intervenes. Power, once peripheral, has shifted. The medieval university has become something the church and kings must reckon with. Not just a tool, but a kind of threat. A body of men who speak Latin fluently, quote Roman law, and understand the careful mechanics of persuasion. Still, it would be a mistake to romanticize it. Most students were not visionaries. Most masters were not brilliant. Many texts were dull, repetitive, or painfully obscure. Exams were long and grueling, and cheating was not uncommon. Some students paid for forged degrees. Others bribed their way into better posts. A few became famous, like Thomas Aquinas or Peter Abelard, but most simply disappeared into the archive. Their names barely mentioned, their work long forgotten. And yet, in all this quiet monotony, something held, a belief, faint, sometimes foolish, that education mattered, not for wealth, though some found it, not for fame, though a few earned it, but because the act of learning, itself of copying, memorizing, arguing, revising, was a kind of devotion. In some cities, the lines between university and monastery blurred. Scholars prayed before lectures. Monks argued before mass. A few even moved between cloisters and classrooms, carrying with them the slow flicker of thought, and the buildings, too, began to change. Stone structures replaced the rented halls. Colleges were endowed by bishops and kings. Dining halls were built, then chapels, then libraries. Bells rang on the hour, marking time not just for prayer, but for study. The pace of life was now set by lectures, disputations, and the long crawl toward graduation. And in those final moments, when a student was called to publicly defend a thesis, surrounded by watching eyes and flickering candles, there must have been a sense of awe, or maybe just relief. A question asked, a pause. An answer given, carefully rehearsed. A nod, and then silence. Years of listening, copying, debating, and surviving, all distilled into a moment that would decide whether the student would become a master, or simply go home with ink-stained hands, and no title to show for it. But whether they passed or failed, something strange had happened. The world had changed around them. A new class had formed, not of nobles, not of priests, but of educated men. Men who could read both scripture and Aristotle. Men who could serve as clerks, teachers, lawyers, and advisors. And in their slow, plodding way, they had helped carve out a space for thought in a world still ruled by war and land and lineage. A quiet revolution, conducted in robes, with ink, and as the candles burned low in the stone lecture halls, and the students drifted back to their cold rooms, one by one, you might wonder, did they dream in Latin. So, tonight, we'll return to a place that wanted to seem grand, and in many ways was. But behind the marble, behind the Latin phrases carved into archways, behind the polished sandals and bright robes, it was still full of dust, sighs, and students trying not to fall asleep. You're in the court of Charlemagne, but you're not a noble. You're a tired pupil in a drafty hall, trying to understand what logic even means, while someone reads aloud in a very slow voice. We begin with a school, one that didn't look like much, and one that was never supposed to end. The story begins in the late 700s, when Charlemagne had already taken most of what he meant to take. He was tall, bearded, a devout Christian with a love for war, politics, and the idea that his empire should be more than swords and taxes. Charlemagne had come to believe that education mattered, not just for monks, not just for bishops, but for his court, and by extension, for the whole empire. And so, slowly and somewhat awkwardly, the idea of courtly schooling began to take shape. It started in Aachen, the imperial palace city, Charlemagne's favorite winter residence. The classrooms weren't grand. A few rooms, modest tables, and students sitting on low stools. And in the center of it all was a man named Alcuin of York. Alcuin was not Frankish. He had come from Northumbria, from the famous library at York, and he was tired. Tired in the way that scholars tend to be, always rereading, always rewriting, always being asked to explain something for the third time before lunch. But he had something the court didn't: books, knowledge, grammar, rhetoric, logic, and a patience for students who didn't know how to hold a quill properly. So Charlemagne put him to work, and work he did. The palace school, as it came to be known, wasn't just for children. It was for nobles, courtiers, clergy, and occasionally even Charlemagne himself, who asked questions, corrected recitations, and reportedly tried to write Latin with mixed success. But let's be honest, the students weren't always thrilled. The hours were long. Lessons included reciting Latin, declensions, memorizing biblical passages, and learning how to argue using words like syllogism and fallacy. And if that wasn't enough, Alcuin had a habit of assigning dialogue exercises, little play acting, sessions between a student and a teacher, meant to sharpen minds and stretch tongues. One such exercise survives. A child is asked, "What is writing?" And he replies, "The guardian of history." That sounds lovely now, but imagine being 9 years old, hungry, cold, and trying to remember that line while your teacher stares at you from beneath a woolen hood. Students in the palace school were not graded, but they were often corrected. They were expected to speak clearly, sit straight, and behave like future men of letters. But some simply nodded off, gently, quietly, heads tilted sideways, while someone tried to explain the difference between substance and accident in Aristotelian logic. And still the lessons went on. Subjects included grammar, the foundational subject, along with rhetoric, dialectic, arithmetic, astronomy, music, and geometry. These were the 7 liberal arts, a model inherited from ancient Rome and repurposed for a Christian empire. But this wasn't Rome. The ink was thicker, the rooms were colder, and sometimes, halfway through a lesson on Latin conjugations, the wind would whistle through the shutters and blow someone's parchment across the room. Alcuin would pause, close his eyes, and wait, then continue. Some students found it exciting, the idea of mastering words, of building arguments, of impressing their peers with clever turns of phrase. Others just wanted lunch. But what Charlemagne hoped, perhaps naively, was that this school would spark something. A renewal, a rebirth of learning that could soften the edges of his empire, that could produce scribes and advisors who understood more than just battle formations and tiths. And in a quiet way, it did. The palace school became the model for other cathedral schools across the Carolingian realm. Bishops and abbots were encouraged to found their own schools, to teach reading and writing, to produce clergy who could interpret scripture without error. It was, in a sense, the beginning of a long, slow educational movement that would ripple outward for centuries. But in these early years, it was still small, still sleepy, and the students, for all their noble birth and fancy cloaks, still had to deal with blotted ink, confusing Latin, and the slow ache of sitting on a hard bench for hours. Some pretended to take notes while doodling faces in the margins. Others squinted at their teachers, trying to stay alert while daydreaming about falconry, warm bread, or anything but the text in front of them. And when lessons ended for the day, they'd stumble out into the stone courtyards, stretch their legs, and maybe mutter quietly about how the master's voice had made them drowsy again. The lecture, after all, never really ended. It would begin again in the morning, same robes, same quills, same scrolls of dusty parchment rolled back open, to the same spot. But perhaps that was the point. Repetition, discipline, learning not through inspiration, but through habit, through doing the same thing again and again and again. And in time, even the sleepiest students began to pick up the rhythms, how to shape their letters, how to argue their thoughts, how to speak in full, formal Latin without needing to think about each word. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. And perhaps that's what made Charlemagne's court different. Not the battles he won, but the quiet decision to bring a scholar from York, to set up a little school in the cold heart of a palace, and to keep learning even when no one felt like it. So, as you drift off tonight, picture yourself in that classroom, not as Charlemagne, not as Alcuin, but as the student half awake at the back of the room, fingers stained with ink, eyes half closed, listening to another slow recitation of a grammar rule that still doesn't make sense. And maybe you'll wonder, would the emperor notice if you nodded off?